Hey, welcome to our spot.
Come on in, guys.
Yeah, we're excited. Welcome back. Get comfy, grab a drink, and bring it on in.
We're excited for today's episode. We're excited to talk about some really awkward and kind of like an unforgiving topic.
Yeah, welcome. We're ripping the Band-Aid off right away with episode 3, talking about rejection. It is not a very fun topic, but it's needed. So yeah, we want to bring it up.
We're excited, yeah. So today we are going to talk about rejection. What is rejection in terms of interpersonal relationships? We're going to touch on how different genders or gender differences in terms of handling rejection. So sexual rejection, just barely. We're also going to talk about how we avoid rejection, and is experiencing rejection good or bad? And then we're going to finish off the episode by talking about how to overcome some of the negative emotions associated with rejection.
Yeah, also stick to the end because we have a little exciting proposal for you guys to join us in this topic of rejection. So let's dive in, Cass.
Yes. So, what is rejection? Essentially, rejection is the opposite of what we all want, which is to be accepted. We all want to be accepted. No one wants to be rejected. So we have developed certain coping mechanisms in fear of or in anticipation of rejection. So the first article I wanted to reference, it's wonderful, written by Mark Leary. This was written in 2015, so it's a little bit older. It's called Emotional Responses to Interpersonal Rejection. And so in this article, Leary examines 7 emotions that often arise when people perceive that their relational value to other people is low or in potential jeopardy, including hurt feelings, jealousy, loneliness, shame, guilt, social anxiety, and embarrassment, right? So this article, I suggest reading it. It will open your eyes. To me, I thought there was a lot of like aha moments in this article, but all of it makes sense, right? Like he essentially talks about these negative, like the negative emotions that are associated with rejection. So there are a couple things that he touches on, but he specifically talks about, where does rejection come from when we are wanting to be accepted in society, and this is something that Driz and I discussed before. So rejection back in the day used to have serious, potentially fatal consequences, right? So in caveman days or even after that, to not be accepted as a part of the group, like you could die. Like that could be like the ultimate consequence. So people, started out wanting to be accepted because of that fundamental principle.
Right. I mean, it was literally detrimental for you to be rejected from your village. Or if you think about, in the times of when we were hunters and gatherers, you lived with your tribe and you moved around. And to be outcasted or to be rejected from that tribe or from your village was a threat to your survival and very, very, very scary. So as we became, animals who lived in societies and kind of created these like little villages and communals, part of being social beings and being part of that society was to be accepted, and you would do anything and everything to not be outcasted. And to this day, that is how we lived. I mean, shame is an emotion that has come up as a result of that survival mechanism. You don't want to be shamed and outcasted because it is literally a threat to your well-being. Obviously, back in the day, it meant no food, it meant no shelter, it meant getting no protection from like animals and all of that. In today's world, I think rejection to our brain has similar consequences, but not necessarily maybe in the physical, but we interpret it that way, especially in social settings, right? I think about being part of a group and doing something that all of a sudden that group kicks you out. Or I think, think about high school, where you are part of the in group or whatever. You have your little clique group in high school and all of a sudden they kick you out. All of those feelings that come up literally feel like you're gonna die. It's like your brain is interpreting it as, oh, this is a threat to my survival, right? But it all comes from that historical context.
Yeah. So in order to successfully live within a group, we have come to an understanding, I guess, that we have to remain in the good graces of other group members, right? And I do just want to clarify that when we're talking about interpersonal relationships, we're talking about friendships, groups, family members, romantic relationships as well. So we do a lot to avoid being rejected, right? Leary, in his article, he talks about a sociometer, and the sociometer is like this thing that's in our head, essentially, that we gauge all the time. It's so weird to think about, right? We're constantly gauging how people react to us and if they're accepting of our behaviors and our patterns, and then we're shifting our behaviors, our attributes, our characteristics based on if they're accepted, right? And I think what's funny is nowadays, this I feel like is probably amplified because of social media, right? Because of likes, because of dislikes, because of comments so easily, I guess, distributed.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, it makes a lot of sense that part of our survival mechanism was to learn to read those social cues and to learn how to read each other as a way to make sure like we are okay, right? Like I like to always think about things from a survival, we're animals trying to live perspective, because ultimately when you can view things from that lens, you can kind of objectively remove your own emotions and understand things from like the big picture, which is my own perspective on this. But it makes sense, that we have learned to kind of gauge like, does this action or the way that this person's body language, how is this going to affect me, right? We learn to view those cues. And as Cassie said, with social media, 100%. And that's been exacerbated because of social media. Back in the day, or even up until like the late 80s, early 90s, you only had to worry about maybe learning how to read your group of 20 people and your family, like those people that you know how to read their cues. Now with social media, we've added a whole nother layer of thousands of people. I mean, if you go, I don't know how many, if you go on Instagram or Facebook, most of us have over 500 friends or, connections on Instagram of a bunch of followers. So now we've created a system that is dependent on these likes and these emojis and how many comments, and there's it's quantifiable now, which then creates like that comparison, and then those fears of like, well, no, I need to manage social media in a way where I am accepted. And I think does definitely create like another layer.
Such a weird thing to think about. It's so strange. Yeah,
Cassie is also a little bit of a social media hands off. I'm a little bit more involved, but it is weird. It's very weird to kind of think about, this virtual world that we've created that now creates all these repercussions in various ways. But even with rejection, like it does add layers to it.
I think, so one of the points that Leary makes, and Driz touched on this as well, is that, Leary points it out. So it's called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the DACC. So it's this group of neural regions in your brain that are associated with physical pain. And in the article, he says that this may help explain why people report that they are hurt when others devalue or reject them.
Right. So for me, when we talked about when Cassie shares the study on the part of the brain that is activated basically when you are rejected, that literally causes the feeling of pain. Makes sense to me. That makes a lot of sense. You feel like a threat. What's the purpose of our brain? The only purpose of our brain is to keep us safe. And I think anybody who's done any type of like research, self-development, all of that stuff, we understand that our brain's job in our body is to keep us safe. We feel the rejection, it's going to cause us pain so that we avoid that feeling, right? Because to us, it's like, oh, this is a threat. I no longer feel safe. The brain's going to do whatever it needs to do to keep us safe. So when I think about adding that understanding to what happens with social media, yes, that makes sense why so many of us are consistently triggered with social media, because that feeling of rejection continuously can happen. Whether it's when you post a picture or you put yourself out there, you are now basically in an audience of thousands of people who can all create a feeling of rejection in you. And that's a lot to handle. So it feels like, back in the day, if you were only rejected by one person, okay, you felt the pain, kept it moving. But now it's like a consistent thing. But that leads us to kind of our next point with when we're going to talk about, how to deal with it. How do we deal with these, like, I'm going to call them micro rejections, right? How do I deal with consistently, maybe every day, if I'm on social media? And now we're kind of taking this topic and referring a little bit just to the virtual social media world. But even in our day-to-day lives, right? How do we deal with that feeling of rejection and what's coming up for us physically when we do get rejected?
Yeah. So I know for me personally, yeah, I would like to say that I'm an expert on rejection, but really, after doing research for this episode, how I deal with rejection is by not like avoiding it. I don't put myself out there. I shy away from anything that could possibly lead to rejection, right? And like I continue to I continue to act on, or I continue actions that will lead to acceptance. So that's really, for me at least, that's how I avoid rejection. And I say, for me, in my experience, that I am an expert with rejection, but really, in my experience, what it has been maybe the last 4 or 5 years I've experienced, I'm going to say two, 3 romantic rejections. And also with applying to jobs. So I graduated and got my master's this past year, and then I took about 2.5 months, almost 3 months of applying to jobs. So I continuously got rejected. And what that does to your psyche, to your self-esteem, how you feel about yourself. I mean, it's no joke. It's more than, just that idea of like hurt feelings. It's not feeling good about yourself. It's not feeling like you're enough, and that can trigger other feelings, and it's just in how you deal with that, right? But for me, that's my experience with rejection. And then in order to not feel that way again, I avoid.
Yeah, and I think that's normal. I think nobody wants to go through those feelings because they do activate a lot of different parts of us, the not feeling enough, or maybe a lot of like different core wounds that all of us have. So we're going to obviously avoid it as much as possible. I think about my own experience with rejection. I avoid, but I would say also I'm a little bit more on the riskier side of things. I remember a couple of years ago, I wanted to move abroad. It was a dream of mine to always live in a different country. And for those that don't know me, I'm originally from Dominican Republic, so I've had the chance to live there, and I've lived here in the USA, in Maryland, the state of Maryland. But I always just wanted to experience a whole different culture. So I decided one day that I was going to move to South Korea to teach English. And I remember, going through that process of applying and figuring it all out. And I was very, very, very particular about where I wanted to go, how I wanted the experience to go. I was teaching English, so like the kids that I wanted to teach. And I had to apply to about maybe like 8 different schools. And the first 5 said no. And each time there was a discouragement, and I did feel a little bit like, oh, maybe I should just not do this. But there was something in me that was like, nope, let's keep finding. And I think the 7th school that I ended up applying to was exactly everything that I wanted, from the age of the children to when they wanted me to move to the area that I wanted to move to. And that experience really, really taught me that if I kind of stay focused on a goal and, okay, this is what I want, I just need to keep going after it and be okay with the no's that came from the other schools. That's an experience that I have. And I will say, even today, like, I do approach things a little bit different when it comes to rejection. And I think that came from experience. I don't avoid it as much anymore, but I think that has come from my own experience, trust that I've cultivated, and all the work that I've done on myself. And actually, a couple of months ago, I was telling Cassie I had seen this video online that was talking about rejection therapy. And I told Cassie, and I was like, I'm going to do this. And she was like, okay. She was like, I think I asked you, I was like, do you want to do it with me? You were like, no. So basically, rejection therapy is this idea that this notion, we'll talk about this video that we saw about it, of the guy who created it, but it's this idea that the more you put yourself out there, you basically desensitize yourself to the no's, and then it becomes easier to kind of accept them. And I honestly don't remember why I did this. I just remember that over the summer, I wanted to put myself out there a little bit more, and I wanted to get a little bit more comfortable with people telling me no. And I was in this creative process of a couple of different projects, this podcast, other things. And I was like, you know what? Let me just try this. And I did it for like maybe 2 weeks. And it was a really cool experience. And it's random things. Like, I remember Cassie and I were getting out of the Coda class on a Saturday morning, and we passed this like little breakfast brunch spot, and I literally looked at the lady and I was like, hey, can I have a bite of your sandwich? And she kind of just looked at me and was like, no. And then I just like laughed it off and kept going. And I know that sounds super silly, and obviously in those cases I have nothing to lose, so it's very easy to just be like, oh, a no to that, cool. But the idea behind it is that the more comfortable you get with people telling you no, the more you understand that it's not a threat to you. It's okay. Even if that no was for something super important, it's the idea of understanding, like, wait, even if somebody tells me no, or if a job tells me no, or if this thing tells me no, I'm going to be okay no matter what. And it's kind of strengthening your own muscle to ask for what you want, but then also strengthening your muscle to receive that no, and understand that just because somebody tells you no or something tells you no, it's not going to kill you. It's not the end of the world. You're going to be okay, and ultimately you will figure it out. So yeah, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else on your experience.
So in the summertime, I was having a conversation with my brother, and I was telling him about this situation with this guy where I'm friends with him, and I have feelings for him, and I have brought up my feelings a number of times. I have to laugh at myself. I've brought up my feelings a number of times, and have been rejected a number of times, every single time. So I was like telling my brother about this, and, I can't remember. I was just like explaining to him how I felt, like what I was thinking and how I was dealing with it. And he was like, yeah, he's like, I just don't think that. He's like, I think that there might be some differences whenever it comes to how women and men like handle rejection, and then he was telling me about a situation with him and someone else. And, his thoughts on it were essentially, could it be that women handle rejection worse. Like in terms of not avoiding rejection, but when they are rejected, they're just poor sports about it, worse than men are, because they're not used to they're not used to being rejected as much. And that, that sparked, like him and I had a really good conversation after that, but that sparked this idea in my head. And I was like, you know what? There might be something to this, And I talked about it with Driz. I talked about it with a couple other of my friends. And for this episode specifically, I found this one article, and I'm sure there's more research out there, or I'm sorry, there are more studies out there, but this one article that I found, it's called Gender Differences in Effective Responses to Sexual Rejection. So I do want to be clear that this was written in 2003 and also in the Netherlands, and it's a study done with 132 people, 67 men, 65 women, and all between the ages of 18 and 30 years old. They were given a questionnaire and a scenario, essentially. I actually recommend reading it. It's actually really interesting. But they found that there is a variance whenever it comes to how men and women, handle rejection, and that women, so essentially men anticipated a less negative and more positive effective response to sexual rejection than women did. And this is revolving around romantic relationships and sexual relationships, mainly just sexual relationships though. And I also wanted to point out, because there are so many fine lines to this, is that it's heterosexual men and women. So that's another thing. So I'm speaking very generally here when I'm talking about genders, and I hope, I'm not meaning to offend anyone. It's just how my mind thinks and how I started to think about, for me, do I handle rejection poorly because of my experience as a female? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that, obviously the article has some gender biases. It is old, but it is part of a conversation that our society lacks, I want to say, because we do gender is a societal construct, right? We all know that. This whole thing that Cassie and I have been talking about here, men and women, like that is a society. It's a construct that we've made up, right? And I think we can go deeper into that. But with that said, are there certain expectations within our society that forces men to accept rejection and maybe women to not cultivate that skill to accept rejection as much as men do? Maybe. And that's kind of what we're bringing up with this point. Obviously, there are different genders that we're not touching into, so it is a little bit biased from our point of view. But in general, yeah, like, are we taught as women to not handle rejection as well as men are taught? Or is there an expectation from our society on how each gender accepts rejection? And I think, again, this goes back to what we were talking about, historical context of how we as human beings have even cultivated this fear of rejection, right? We live in a very patriarchal gender society. So how does that impact the way that we handle rejection? Is there a layer of a gender bias that impacts the way men and women do accept rejection? I don't know. Again, this was one study, but I think these are the topics and the questions that we want to have conversations around and get everyone's kind of brain thinking around what happens in childhood, right? As we're raising boys and girls, for them to handle this emotion differently.
Yes. So essentially, a question I asked myself after that conversation with my brother is, if I was born a man and I had, romantically put myself out there multiple times and been rejected, would I handle the rejection that I have felt over the last, year or so better? That's the question I asked myself.
Yeah, and that goes back to like what I was talking about with the rejection therapy, that the more you put yourself out there, you kind of become desensitized to the rejection and you get better at it, right? In some ways, because of these gender roles that our society perpetuates, men are expected to be the ones to put themselves out there, and women are the ones that are expected to say no. So is there a correlation between, you know, men consistently having to put themselves out there that makes them better at handling the feeling of rejection versus the opposite with women? Yeah, maybe. That's a very good like point.
Yeah, and what are the impacts of that? Because, you know, once you're able to handle rejection, you know, I'm just gonna say not as poorly as I do. Then, you know, then you can start being a little riskier, like Driz said. And that, I think, brings us to our point of, is experiencing rejection good or bad? And when we were doing research for this, we found an awesome podcast by Rob Dial. How long was the podcast, Driz? 20 minutes?
Yeah, it was a very like quick, really good listen to. We'll share it in the episode notes for you guys to check it out. It was a short episode, 30 minutes, I think.
It's called The Mindset Mentor. I've actually listened to a couple other of his episodes. He's actually awesome. And like I said, it's a very short listen. And he talks about, I mean, in that episode, Rob just talks about how rejection is good. He gives a couple examples of people that have had to overcome rejection. The owner of Spanx, or like the founder of Spanx, which is a female, how she was raised. His story is that she was raised in a household where her father said, every day you're going to experience rejection. Like, I'm going to reject, I don't know if I'm going to reject you, but he said it was his goal that his kids were taught rejection every single day. And that ended up being a huge benefit to her later on in life when she's trying to start this company and she was okay with being rejected, you know? And so again, this podcast episode was really beneficial in the way where, you know, from his perspective, rejection is good.
Yeah, and it was a very interesting listen, because when I listened to the episode, I was like, okay, yeah, I mean, rejection does have its benefits because it does build resilience and it allows you to kind of cultivate an inner confidence to know that, okay, just because one person says no, I can keep going. And I thought that was amazing to have a parent to give you that life lesson at such a young age, which then ultimately led to this person creating this amazing company that is still around today. However, now that I'm like listening to you, you know, kind of debrief on that, Cassie, I think about him being a guy and giving that perspective of, you know, rejection is a good thing because maybe in his mind, you know, it's something that it's more accepted. For me, when I also listened to that episode, there was a part of me that, you know, understood his goal with the episode of like, oh yeah, you know, rejection is part of life. You got to get better at it. And then amazing things happen when you accept rejection. But I also think in order for you to accept that rejection and for you to be able to handle that, you need to have a level of safety and security available to you that I do think a lot of minorities don't have. Or a lot of different demographics don't have, right? I think about, you know, and Cassie and I always like to bring in different angles on certain topics, but I think about a person who, you know, doesn't have a safety net. Rejection literally is like a threat to their well-being, whether that is like a job, right? Like if a person's applying to a job and they get a no, you know, if you have a house or you have somebody to lean on, it may be easier to accept that no. But if you're counting on that job to feed you yourself and your kids and your family, like that no can literally make or break you. And again, to your brain, it is like a threat to your survival. So sometimes, you know, you can look at things from a good or bad angle, but it's not that black and white, right? We can sit here and be like, yeah, rejection's good. It makes you stronger. Or no, rejection's awful. It threatens your survival and, you know, all of that. But there's always that gray. There's always like every situation can be a little bit different. But yeah, it was a good episode. I don't know if you have anything else to share about that.
We live in the gray over here.
It's great.
Yeah, so I think, you know, so far and in my small experience with rejection in my life, I think rejection is good. I think I have fear of rejection because the feelings associated with it are bad. I want to be accepted. If I'm rejected, that feels bad. It also can be literally detrimental, as Driz has just pointed out. Like, it can be my well-being, financial security. It can mean, you know, food, water, shelter.
And ultimately, that's the thing, right? It's part of life. So we're trying to kind of bring in an understanding of how we got here, how we're dealing with it currently, and, you know, how can we get better? And yeah, there is no right or wrong, good or bad. It's all gray. Every circumstance is going to be a little bit different for everyone. But ultimately, yeah, this is part of life, and it's okay if for you rejection is a little bit harder to take than others, because we're human, and everyone's experience obviously is gonna shape how we handle those emotions and those feelings that come with rejection.
So the last thing that I really wanted to touch on was just how to overcome some of these negative emotions associated with rejection, right? So again, as somebody that handles rejection poorly, so I just never really put myself out there to be rejected, how could I possibly navigate trying to get rejected more without, you know, experiencing all the fear, or any of the negative emotions associated with rejection. And in that Mindset Mentor episode, Rob ends up talking about the 100 Days of Rejection by Gia John. Again, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, but we will have this available for you all to watch. It's this YouTube video. He's actually really funny. It's a really easy watch. But Gia John is doing this TED Talk about his journey of 100 Days of Rejection, and how, you know, he just started off doing, and I think he started from a website too that someone had created that kind of had these different prompts for different days. And there's, at least from what I can remember from the video, I'm sorry if I'm, you know, incorrectly citing it, but there was 30 days of rejection. He was like, no, I'm going to do 100 days. I'm going to see how this works for 100 days. So he actually videotaped, how old am I? He recorded himself being rejected for 100 days, and he says rejection is good, and he kind of talks about how to overcome some of the negative emotions associated with rejection through, you know, putting yourself out there in these little ways, kind of like what Driz was talking about with her experience. So, you know, whether that's like asking for a free coffee, or, you know, asking a stranger for $5 or whatever. And again, noting that these are less risky ways of putting yourself out there just to get comfortable with the idea of rejection.
And I'm just going to add that, like, I don't think the goal is to not have the feelings that come with rejection. Like, I think, Cassie, you mentioned, like, you know, how do I deal with rejection without the negative feelings? I don't think that's possible. And I don't think that that is the goal. I think the goal is ultimately to know that when these feelings come up, you can become strong enough to handle them and to build that resilience, right? Like, the feelings are going to be there no matter what. How do I, AKA, the word is desensitized, but I kind of just think you just become stronger at handling the feelings physically, mentally, all of that, right? So the feelings are going to be there regardless when you put yourself out through these rejections. But the more you do it, that's the goal. It's kind of like going to the gym. Lifting 10 pounds of weight is always going to be the same, but the more you do it, the stronger you become type thing, right? So that's kind of like the goal with it. And yeah, with that, how can we get better at it? We're actually going to invite you guys all to a little challenge. We are going to launch a rejection challenge with us. So follow us if you don't already. We are on Instagram at Podcast Our Spot, as well as on Facebook and YouTube and the social medias. So come and find us, and we're going to do in a couple of weeks a rejection challenge, and we would love all of you to participate and kind of get your feedback and see how you felt as you put yourself out there. You know, did it in the beginning, was it scary and you got better through it, or you absolutely hated it? But anyways, we want to kind of put that out there and see if you guys are interested in joining us in this.
I'm excited and nervous and so scared, but I am so excited to experience this with Driz. It would be awesome if some of you all did it with us. If not, that's cool. You guys can just speculate and let us know what you think. And then also, if you have any other experiences with rejection, or with negative emotions or positive, associations with rejection, like, please feel free to share with us your experience, because we're always learning and trying to understand and open to, what you guys have to offer and share with us.
Let's get better at getting rejected. Let's just see how it goes. I don't know. We're excited. All right.
All right. Until next time.
See y'all at the next episode of Our Spot. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Bye.